ILS, LPV, RNAV, LNAV, NDB, VNAV. Is anyone else confused? Well, welcome. It's the Flying Doctor. If you're confused about the different types of approaches that are available into your airport on the sim, you've come to the right place, I think. Anyway, welcome. If you do like my output, please like and subscribe. And yes, during this tutorial, we're going to take a brief and oversimplified look at the various options for approaching runways that are available in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. But much of what I have to say is transferable across other sims as well. I thought it would be easiest to start by going first to what you might call the Holy Grail. And if you use little Navmap, you'll be familiar with this. When you open up the map, you will find that for certain airports you have these significant green flags leading in, getting tighter and tighter up to the runway. Yes, these are the ILS, the Instrument Landing System approaches. It's easiest to start by understanding approaches by starting at this highest level, this most precise of all approaches. And then we'll go back to, well, what if you have absolutely nothing apart from a simple two-dimensional track into your airport? The most important thing to understand is that ILS is a precision approach. So an ILS system can get you up to 100 foot, 60 foot around, above the touchdown surface for the runway. There are visual rules by which point you need to be seeing the runway before you commit to a landing. We'll come on to that later because that applies right the way through the whole set of approaches that are available, and they get increasingly tougher to meet depending on how non-precise the approach is. The ILS system, which is almost like a cone of descent, gives the aircraft information from the ground about the bearing it needs to take and about the altitude that it needs to be at, and that includes a glide slope. So if you look here, you'll most likely be familiar with this. You've got 110.30, which is a frequency that's coming and being broadcast by equipment on the ground. 269 degrees, which is the bearing that we're looking at to land at this runway that happens to be at Heathrow, and we have a glide slope of 3 degrees. So yes, ILS, the absolute gold dust of the airways. So we'll jump straight into a Jepperson chart. If you've not had the opportunity to view a Jepperson chart before, I thoroughly encourage you to make an investment, if you can, into Navigraph charts. There are FAA charts, but Navigraph organises its material differently, and for a relatively small fee it's possible to collate a huge amount of information about airports across the world, and departures and arrivals, and also navigation information to get you from one airport to another. Integrates of course with the H145 if you use the H145 by Height Performance Group with the tablet, and it also integrates with the GTN 750. So here we are, looking just to the left hand side. If you've not seen a chart before, I've included a really good guide, and I'll put the link in the description, but it really leaves nothing else to question in showing you what all of this information means. There's a format here for an approach page. At the top you've got communications, you can see there. I'm not going to major on this because we're actually talking about the different types of approaches. You've got approach briefing information here. Underneath it you've got a approach plan view, you've got a profile view, and then you've got landing minimums at the bottom. So as you can see here, runway 27 right, it's ILS, Instrument Landing System, DME, which is distance measuring equipment, or Localiser, distance measuring equipment. So it's not about what's on the ground, that's about what's required in the aircraft for runway 27R. And down here you can see as well the glide slope, can't you? So I will have a look at the approach briefing information just because this does vary according to different approaches. but it's a localizer that you dial into your navigation unit. There's the approach that you want to be looking at, 269 degrees, the final approach course. The aircraft, once it finds the localizer signal, will adjust, but it's always good practice to approach in line with the localizer. Also, you'll find that there is, as you can see here, a channel at which you will intercept the signal, whichever bearing you take to arrive along this route. Another critical piece of information is just here, 2,500 feet it says, and in brackets 2,422. So at 2,500 feet, that's saying you will want it to intersect, and there it is there, the little, you can see the little Maltese cross there. At 2,500 feet you'll intersect the ILS course, and the aircraft will pick up the signal from the ground. The ILS will guide the aircraft down. The ILS equipment is based on the ground, and the aircraft has equipment within it to detect the signals that the ILS is sending out. You've got the decision altitude here for the ILS, and this will be very close to the ground. That's 200 foot above the ground, 287 feet above sea level. That's the point at which the pilot makes a decision about whether to land. So you can see why ILS is really helpful, particularly for flying in bad weather, because you just need 200 feet of visibility to be able to land safely. So that's it. So that's a simple description, the kind of gold star of navigation for looking to land. And also just to help us out, we've got the airport elevation on the top bar here, and just below it the runway elevation. So the airport elevation is officially at 83 feet. The runway elevation at the threshold is 78 feet. And also there's information about what to do if you miss an approach. But we're here to talk about the ILS approach. This is the gold standard, and then I'm going to move on and say, well, let's say we haven't got any guidance at all in terms of vertical navigation. What does that then lead us, and how does that help us to understand what the different forms of navigation are? Let's just look for a moment in a theoretical world where we don't have any GPS at all, and all we have is VFR and a NDB, a non-directional beacon, to guide us. Now on this map, using Navmap, I've taken away most of the way markers. There are some still there on these major routes, but just ignore these for the moment, and just think that you're sat at this airport up here to the northeast, and we want to arrive at Bray, and in order to do that we need to follow a radio signal. Now the beacon here, the best way of imagining it is it's broadcasting across every single radial of the compass rose. So the first thing we do is tune the aircraft's navigation in to receive the signal from the beacon, and there's a frequency there, 321.0, and also we can listen into the audio Morse to ensure that we're listening in on the right beacon. So for example, there's another one here, GI 339.0, and then oddly enough there's one just to the north of the map up here further away, VSCL 317.0, but for the moment we're just going to think about ABY. So what we would do is that we would take off from the airport here, and we would fly the radial that is going to the beacon, and then when we're over the beacon we would select the radial away from the beacon that will glide us on the flight path so that we can find the runway. That's a very unsophisticated way of putting it. I have seen it done that in fact what would happen is that you would go across and then down and come around and find the flight path for greater accuracy. But suffice to say, this is the simplest way of putting things. One additional feature that you may be interested to know is that it is possible to know when you've flown directly overhead the NDB. So you can know when you're exactly at this point, and therefore how far you have to go to the runway. And if you were looking to intersect here, although the course would be a little bit more sophisticated, if you were looking to understand how far you were from the NDB, it's possible to do that by travelling perpendicular to the radials, or as perpendicular as you can make it, and measuring the time difference that it's taking to move from one radial to another. So if you know your speed and you know the time difference to get from one radial to another, then you can approximate your position along a particular radial. So it does give some idea along a radial. It can give some idea of your position, but it's not something that you can quickly review without moving the aircraft. This is old technology, and also it's not really appreciated very much, although it keeps you spatially aware. That's because the radio signals can be impacted by other geological features, time of day, and also even though you might be flying a particular radial, you have to give account of the wind. So it's actually much more complex than this. The confusing thing is that very often the NDBs can act as waymarkers within GPS themselves, because of course they're an object on the ground, and they have a latitude and a longitude, and they can be a GPS marker rather than a radio marker. So you can have a GPS path and you can include an NDB, and when you load that up within your flight plan, you're not actually using the NDB. To deliberately navigate via NDB is something rather different. So we are now looking at runway 27. Well, look at that. You can see a big difference there. It's saying that in the equipment, it's an interesting line here. So this is a beacon. So as I follow my route in, which is from around about here, I'm following this track 265 degrees and I'm in line with this beacon. And that's all I got to land the aircraft. There is no vertical indication coming from that beacon at all about how high I should be. That I need to do myself, and you can see in the elevation chart below, in the profile below, it's saying that I need to be at 3,000 feet, and this is an extreme example because there's no marker even on the profile here as to when I need to descend, apart from it does say there's this little signal saying 1 here. It says you need ADF and DME required, so direction finder and distance measuring equipment in the aircraft. You're going to have to switch the lights on yourself as the pilot. Pilot controlled lighting 119.655, and if you can't get air traffic service to give you an altimeter reading, you need to contact Lil ATIST or Lil Approach. So yeah, this is really bare bones stuff, and you can see it's saying you need to drop from 3,000 feet to 1,640 feet to arrive at the NDB at 3.9 miles out from the runway, and then it's a 3 degree, you can see the 3 degree there, it's a 3 degree glide slope to land on the runway, as far as I understand it. So we're talking minimal here. What's interesting, if you look across here, you will find the beacon details, and you will find the approach details. You'll find the height 1640 at which you need to be over the directional beacon, and that happens to be 1,291 meters above ground level. The decision altitude is 441 feet above the ground, or 790 feet above sea level. So you can see that because it's a non-precision approach, the decision altitude, the point at which you have to make a decision to land, is higher than it is for an ILS. So that's about as simple as I can put it. So the simplest forms of navigation do not have the vertical element in it to guide you. Okay, so we have looked at an ILS landing, And here you can see an ILS landing that's actually on offer at Albert Bray rather than at Heathrow. You can see this cone of descent at 265 degrees on 108.75. The instrumentation's on the floor. The aircraft has the instrumentation to pick it up and interpret it into the autopilot system. So we have looked at ILS, we've looked at NDB, which is virtually nothing, one beacon to go towards with a direction finder. You've gone from the sublime with ILS here to the virtually nothing here. There are even, as I pointed out, there are even no way markers suggested to find your way so that you're on track. So what we're going to now look at is what happens when we incorporate a degree of vertical navigation, and all of the other labels that you'll see around, so RNP, RNAV, VNAV, they are variations of ways in which the instrumentation in the aircraft is able to follow a set and pre-agreed navigational route that has been published before. So for example, we've got an RNP, stands for Required Navigation Performance route here for runway 27 for Albert, and you can see immediately that we've got a lot more information on the screen here. You'll notice that there is not a frequency that we need to tune to for our NDB or for our ILS. There is a channel number. Now, if you are flying the H145, you do not need to input that number anywhere. You pick the approach that you need in order to land, and that is automatically inputted into the GTN 750. But my guess is that in other instrumentation within flight simulation that you may even be able to input this channel number in. I'm wondering, for example, if that's the case on the Garmin 1000 or if it's all done automatically. But never mind, this is just an illustration of what is changing. So yes, we've got a final approach, we've got a mandatory reporting at 3,000 feet or 2,651 foot above ground that we're present. It's an LPV approach, precision with vertical guidance, and the decision height is 200 feet, and then the other information about the runway height, elevation of the airport and the elevation of the runway. So if we have a look here, so for example, if you are flying in, you would be looking to connect perhaps at Oglib or at FAQ 27, but it's absolutely key that you connect to FAQ 27. You need to report it at 3,000 feet. When you're at 3,000 feet, the navigation system, if you program this route in to your navigational unit, the navigational system will set the glide path for you. There is some variation in the accuracy. That's not just to do with the accuracy of the descent, it's to do with the accuracy of the flight path. So for example, the older systems were limited. They made poor use of airspace because they took quick turns, whereas the more modern forms of navigation are able to curve a route, and that means that there's much better use of the airspace, and so that's what's varying. The next RNP approach that we're going to look at, well, we're going to Bogota in Colombia for this particular example. This is a LNAV VNAV approach. LNAV VNAV. So in other words, just imagine for a moment that you didn't have any ground equipment at all. Okay, so no ILS beacon, no NDB, for whatever use the NDB beacons are, but no NDB. All you have is the GPS data combined with the set of altitudes that you need to be at as you descend to the runway threshold. That is LNAV VNAV, an LNAV VNAV approach. And well, what more is there to say really in this particular example? you would go into your navigational unit, you would select the approach, it's highlighted here, RNP runway 13R. If you are using, I suspect, a GTN 750, you select that approach and that will automatically load the combination of the lateral track to enable you to find the safe passage to the runway with the altitudes programmed in. Your navigational unit connects and with your autopilot, and the aircraft simply follows the vertical and lateral navigation down to the runway threshold. So relatively simple and straightforward. I thought it would be helpful to return back to the ILS that we started with and just work through a summary of the different navigational approaches. So the first approach we looked at was an ILS approach, an instrument landing system approach, which is the gold dust of the airways, as I refer to it, where you have instrumentation on the ground in the form of a localiser, and that sends information to an aircraft about the glide path that it needs to fly in order to reach the runway safely. ILS can be extremely accurate. The one thing that I didn't mention is that there are different categories of ILS. Each one of those will take you to a lower minimum before you need to make a decision on landing. We then went from the sublime to the ridiculous, and we looked at the Non Directional Beacon approach, the NDB approach. This is Albert as well in France, runway 27. And we noticed that all an NDB approach will give you is a radial that you can travel to find the beacon, and then, and it's not always the case, from the beacon you will be able to follow a radial out and directly along the flight path that you need to be on in order to land the aircraft. No vertical information given whatsoever. We then looked at what different types of approaches were available between those two extremes, and we looked at RNP, required navigational performance. Also, we note that RNP, in fact, this is a chart dating from September 21. You can see here I'm quite surprised at this because RNP is no longer used as the description. It's actually performance-based navigation, PBN, just to confuse you. But the most important thing here is that if you were to think about what GPS is able to offer, this is GPS combined with a localiser. This is LPV here for this particular RNP approach, LPV, and LPV stands for Localiser Performance with Vertical Guidance. So what you have is that you have a horizontal navigation through GPS, but you still have some vertical guidance coming from the ground. So yes, an RNP LPV. And we then moved on to look at a different RNP approach, a different type, and this is LNAV VNAV. So in other words, this is a combination of pre-programmed GPS information giving you the two-dimensional track and the vertical changes to the course programmed in a flight plan, which is approved. So this is a published approved route beforehand, but if you were to enter into your navigational unit and saying that you wanted to follow RNP runway 13R, that's the approach you wanted, then this would automatically surface. And to conclude, I thought it might be helpful just to return to a cockpit at some point. So this is the H145. I think one of the reasons for the confusion around approaches is that there's so many different names, and even as I've outlined today, for example, we've got charts that have got say required navigation performance, but we're no longer using that as a phrase. It's performance based navigation, and also you've got this array of symbols coming at you all the time, particularly when you're in the cockpit. But I thought I'd just show this diagram here and then just talk to it and just illustrate some of the things that might surface as you've inputted an approach that you want to fly and the array of signals that come up. Now, of course, every navigational unit will be different, but let's just have a look at this first. So on the screen here, you can see that we're on an ILS course for a start. You can just see the flag just coming in there, and there is Navigraph on the GTN 750. You can see NAV1 there, 108.55. You can also see it up here, and it's telling me I'm on ILS 1. So it's ILS input 1, because I can put more than one ILS course in there. And the second thing that you'll be able to see is that on the screen here, I've got LOC, LOC, and G/S. So what that tells me is that the navigation system has found the localizer and also is flying on a glide slope provided by the localizer. IAS, by the way, here is the airspeed. Don't need to worry about that. But what I have noticed is that when you, for example, fly an approach, you can get an APP appear here and a VNAV appear here and a mix of signals. Now, it's not possible, and it's beyond the remit of this particular tutorial to go into what's going to happen with your aircraft when you input a particular approach. But I think the difficulty is that you will see perhaps VNAV or you'll see LNAV up in the details here in your primary flight display when you are working with your navigation unit. So these terms get bandied about and it gets really quite confusing. But suffice to say, I hope that this was helpful as a start. My next project will be having flown an ILS approach in the H145. Don't forget this is a beta project. But having flown an ILS in the H145, I'm going to go back and look at seeing if I can fly some of these other approaches and see how we're able to do that using the GTN 750. So take care, stay safe. If you haven't seen the ILS video that I've done before, that would be really helpful and put some of these approaches in context. Because although you're looking at ILS, the principles are the same when you're dealing with intersecting a set course, for example. So take care, stay safe. Don't forget, if you've enjoyed what you've seen and appreciated the content, don't forget to like and subscribe and keep me and other geeks alive. Take care, folks. Stay safe.